Dad, you got this one? Pop it and send it.
Hello, and welcome to Kent County CLOSEUP. I'm Deb Havens, Democratic candidate for Kent County Commission in Plainfield Township and the City of Rockford. I decided to run for office because of the water crisis that began in my district years ago and continues today throughout our state and beyond, and unfortunately will be with us well into the future. My guest today is Dr. Rick Rediske, Professor of Water Resources at the Grand Valley State University Annis Water Resources Institute, with a connection to state, federal, and international agencies engaged in environmental analysis. He's also very engaged here locally as we face the challenge of polyfluoral chemicals known as PFAS and PFOS in drinking and groundwater. So Dr. Rediske, thank you so much for being with us here today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I want you to take us back. In August 2017, you authored a very carefully researched memo to the Grand Rapids office of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, and you were warning of the likely PFAS contamination at the Wolverine Worldwide Tannery in Rockford. That memo helped to initiate our current awareness of the situation, so I'm very grateful for that action that you took.
Thank you.
Take us back to that time. What actually precipitated your memo, and how did we get to where we are now?
Well, I started working with a group of citizens called the Concerned Citizens for Responsible Remediation, and they were concerned about the contamination at the tannery, potential contamination at the Wolverine Tannery in Rockford. And the more I dug into the types of chemicals they were using and just the setting that it was in, I became concerned about PFAS or PFOS, the Scotchgard ingredient that might be in the water around the tannery, and I was also concerned about it in the sludges that were disposed of off-site. And the first confirmation of that is when they found PFOS in the Rogue River, in the fish in the Rogue River, yes. And that was kind of the confirmation. So I put together a group of facts, patent search and things like that, different information from professional journals that show that they were using PFOS at the site, which is Scotchgard.
And so then we've unfolded this whole dramatic situation over the past year or so. Where are we now in this situation? How do you feel the state and other agencies have responded to this situation?
Well, we're in the very aggressive data collection stage, so we're doing quite a bit of groundwater sampling, private well sampling, surface water sampling, checking the fish, so we're getting more information on how far the PFAS chemicals have spread, and it's not only in Michigan, West Michigan, but it's all across the state right now.
What is going to be done with all this data?
Well, each site has to be characterized, and then they have to come up with a remedy or a solution for it. And that may be some type of containment, some type of treatment, bringing in public water. Each site's going to be looked at differently on what to do.
Okay, well let's talk a little bit about the specifics here, and I'm glad that you brought along some slides to help us understand the extent of the threat. The EPA still hasn't issued a, I guess, enforceable limit on fluorinated chemicals in drinking water. They started out with a guideline of 70 parts per trillion, and we learned recently from a separate report that that might be something like 10 times too high a level. You've talked about the impact of even 1 part per trillion, and even though it's equal to a grain of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, that it still has impact. We have a slide that I'd like you to reference here just quickly. Yeah, when you take a look at that, talk us through why 1 part per trillion can really make a difference to a human body.
Well, for certain chemicals, 1 part per trillion is a grain of sand in an Olympic pool. It's very, very small. Things like glucose, like salt, they're not relevant at that particular concentration. But when you have chemicals that bioaccumulate, like like mercury and PCBs, those materials can go from parts per trillion in the environment into parts per million inside fish. And that's why we have fishing advisories for both mercury and PCBs.
And it looks like it's obvious within the human system, too, that it can make a big difference.
Right. And then the endocrine system runs at parts per trillion and parts per billion levels. And things like our thyroid hormones, the pituitary hormone, parathyroid hormone, those are all very significant at parts per trillion. So if you were talking about somebody's hormonal system, you would never say that a part per trillion is not significant. So when you have chemicals that interact with the endocrine system, then parts per trillion are significant.
And I noted too, thanks, we can let that slide go now, your emphasis that especially over a long period of time, and I think this is kind of confusing, at least for me, when we hear that 70 parts per trillion cumulative, you know, it's still a safe level, although that's been challenged now. But how do you accumulate? Do you just, after a number of years, measure to find out if you're at 70 parts per trillion? What does it mean to accumulate?
It's more complicated for PFAS chemicals. For lead, we tend to build up lead in our bones. For PCBs, we build that up in our fat tissue, adipose tissue. For mercury, it accumulates in the muscle tissue. But the PFAS chemicals actually bind to proteins in our blood, so they circulate in our bloodstream, and the proteins hold on to it, so we get an accumulation from that factor. And also our kidneys are very good at retaining proteins, so we do not excrete albumin or other proteins in urine, so we get a concentration factor from reabsorption or the lack of excretion. So when we run an animal test and we give it a certain level of PFAS chemicals, we will have 100-fold greater in our blood with the same dose than what the animals would have.
Oh my gosh. Well, that's because of the size of our bodies, or what?
No, it's just our bodies handle it differently.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it's sometimes animals are similar, sometimes animals are different, sometimes humans are different, and this is a case where the human metabolism is much different than, let's say, a rat or a mouse.
So those tests that they have conducted on rats and mice, is this why the reason, I mean, I've heard that it's very difficult to transfer the results of those tests to make it mean anything for human.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have to be extra cautious when you make that comparison. You have to factor in the fact that we're getting a higher dose when you interpret the data.
Okay. Now, you've stated recently that about 40% of PFAS exposure comes from our drinking water, but 60% comes from other sources. And I thought this was really a remarkable fact. And we do have a slide that shows some of the sources that you reference. If we could take a look at that.
Right, the PFAS compounds typically in the past were Scotchgard, Stainmaster carpet, Simonized wax, of course Gore-Tex and Teflon. Those are all the big name materials that used PFAS compounds. We also find it in fast food wrappers. Whenever you get a sandwich or something like that, the grease does not bleed through it.
Oh, yeah.
And that's because it's coated with PFAS compounds. Candy wrappers, microwave popcorn bags, personal care products, dental floss. The reason why it slides between your teeth really well is there's the fluorinated compounds on the dental floss.
Stain-resistant carpet. I mean, who does not have?
Right.
Yeah, pesticides, potting soils. What on earth, how is it in a potting
That's to
soil?
make it, to have air space in it. You know, you like, you know, I don't want to say, it's not flocculent, but you want potting soil that's got a lot of air that doesn't clump together. So.
Wow. Well, okay, so thanks for that slide. You can take that down. Well, so as pervasive as it is, you know, when I was at one of the conferences where you spoke, and also the director of Flow was there, saying that basically we have to get rid of PFAS and PFOS. we have to get it out of the chemical, I don't know, what the bonds, break those, get them out of the products that we use every day. How possible is that when you see a list like that?
Well, we just have to, the field of green chemistry is when you design something based on its environmental properties, and we just need to look for alternatives that do not have the same characteristics of binding to your proteins and not degrading in the environment.
And you have faith that that's possible?
There's quite a large green chemistry movement now, and people are actually looking at those properties first before they even produce a chemical.
But does it require the federal government to be more involved than it is right at the moment in this process?
For PFAS, yes it does, because it's not a regulated chemical right now.
Wow.
Yeah. It was actually discontinued and banned in a number of foreign countries, but the United States has never really taken it on as a chemical to regulate.
But it would certainly seem then that those countries are not purchasing the materials that we make here using those chemicals, so there's an economic impact that you would think might make a difference.
Oh, I'm sure there is, and the properties of the PFAS chemicals are desirable, and we just need to look at alternatives that do not, that actually will break down over a period of time.
Well, I'll certainly second that thought. So, yeah, I guess leapfrogging off of that, obviously everyone has been exposed to this chemical in some way, shape, or form, and unless you're off in the jungle somewhere and with no possible exposure to civilization as we describe it. So how do we actually compare with, I guess if you looked at the US and all people in our country, is there a sense of just where we're at in terms of contamination, and then maybe how we compare here in Michigan? We do have another slide.
Sure, sure. Our blood levels are 1,000-fold greater than the levels that we're talking about in water right now. So,
wow.
And that's because we've accumulated it and it binds to proteins, et cetera. The average right now in the United States is about 2 parts per billion. That's 1,000 parts per trillion, but it's about 2 parts per billion. Back in the year 2000, the average was about 30.
Wow.
So our concentrations have went down considerably. When you start looking at some of the larger exposures, like the C8 study, which was the one that helped define the toxic properties of PFAS chemicals. This was funded by DuPont, related to a lawsuit. Some of those exposures were up in around 228 parts per billion. If you look at DuPont workers, 410. If you look at 3M workers, they were over 1,000 parts per billion.
My gosh.
So if you bring in some of the exposures that have been reported in the newspaper, there's been very limited amounts of blood testing, but there's a 2-year-old infant now in Belmont area with 500 micrograms, or 500 parts per billion, so he has accumulated over the amount that a typical DuPont worker actually working in the PFAS production.
Wow.
In just 1.5, 2 years of his life. And we also have some residents that have higher blood levels than 3M workers that were actually making Scotch guards. So the exposures have been relatively significant in this area.
So we have a little child at age 2 with this kind of a level, and you've stated that it's really quite problematic to have a long-term exposure. So what do we know about the dangers that we face in this circumstance?
Well, the first thing to do was to get filtered water, clean up the water source, so over time that level will go down. But there's certainly a host of different symptoms or different diseases that might be associated with PFAS exposure, like sometimes vaccines are not as active in people that have PFAS in their blood, so you need boosters. We just need to do some additional medical monitoring for that.
So at this point then the child becomes, I guess, you're not making this child like a subject in a test so much as saying, well, we just need to flag his medical chart?
Well, what happened during the Flint water crisis is that a number of people that had high blood levels, they were watched more closely. They were given better nutritional supplements, which helps offset lead. So the people that have high blood levels need to be watched a little more closely.
What about other people who want to have their blood tested? Because okay, I admit I'm not 100% up on this, but I understand that if you did not have a 70 parts per trillion test in your, let's say, well water, you might not become part of lawsuits or, let's say, mitigating services that Wolverine was providing. What is the circumstance? And
well, I'm not sure what the cutoff was for the filters. I think it was lower. I think they were providing filters if you had any contamination detected. I'm not
really?
sure. But as far as blood testing, that usually fits in with epidemiological studies where they're looking at a larger population. And if you're over a certain level, they probably will have a test group, let's say over 70. I'm not sure what the cutoff will be, but they will look for a control group that has, a normal exposure, and then they will look at a test group which has the exposure from the PFAS chemicals.
okay, and then when they're looking at these two groups, they're looking for what? Disease outcomes?
Right. What they would do is look for incidence of prostate cancer. There's a whole list of diseases that they're looking at.
Mm-hmm. But do you see the value in people having a blood test?
Well, the blood test tells you what your exposure was. So the only way you'll know if you have an average exposure or if your exposure is 10 times or 100 times or 1,000 times the average is if you have your blood test run. And it's hard to get blood tests right now. The technology isn't readily available to people.
Well, it's not available here, but
Right.
it seems to be available in California and New Jersey. I mean, they are doing blood testing
Right.
in those states. So
Right.
what's the holdup here?
Well, we just have to have certified laboratories that perform the test. There are laboratories that are talking about doing that right now. So,
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully we get beyond the talking stage
Right.
fairly soon. Okay, so let's talk about the future. We do have one last slide here. You listed recently some of the challenges that you feel are faced as we try to deal with this PFAS
Correct.
challenge.
one of the major challenges is funding for research and monitoring. We do need to get an idea where the PFAS chemicals are and then how to treat them. We do not have very good options for treatment. And we also don't have really good options, not options, but we don't have a really good understanding about the health impacts. We have lots of data, but we need more studies. We need a body of evidence to make our decisions from, not just one particular study. Mm-hmm. So that's a real key thing. And then the communities need support. Once you've had a determination that your water is contaminated, there's lots of questions that are going on in the community. They need to make decisions about medical monitoring, about what types of water to drink, sources of water, and especially in areas like Belmont. We need to look at well permits and how wells are protected from contamination. So it really gets us into a much larger discussion, and communities need to have those discussions, so there has to be some type of funding to facilitate those discussions.
Right. Is there anything like that on the horizon? And I think we're finished with that slide. Thank you.
Yes, I'm interested in having some type of a public advisory council for PFAS chemicals in Kent County. And we have several sites. We have a large area of groundwater that's contaminated, the Rogue River. We also have the Thornapple River. So I think it's good that we sit down as a community and talk about issues like blood testing, like monitoring, like different strategies for well protection, permitting, that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. So you've had experience with groups like this before?
Yes, the two really good examples in this area are Muskegon Lake and White Lake, and we've had public advisory councils that have dealt with very serious contamination issues like occidental chemical. In Muskegon, we had lots of heavy metal pollution, mercury in the sediment. So public advisory councils are together for a long time, and we've been meeting in Muskegon for 30 years, and
Wow.
White Lake just got removed from the area of concern list, so they reached all of their milestones. But it's a constant process of engaging the public, engaging the government.
Yes.
We invite the government to the meetings. The government does not call the meetings. I mean, we invite them and we ask them for what's going on, and then we provide our input to what they're doing. So we're a very strong, active stakeholder in the cleanup process.
Let's just linger on that phrase for a moment, cleanup process.
Right.
How do you see this being resolved? I mean, as I understand it, the technology for cleaning up groundwater doesn't exist.
Right. There are certain areas that are very high in contamination, like the border of the tannery and the Rogue River, and they will probably wind up putting in some type of a barrier so the groundwater no longer seeps into the Rogue River, and they will pump that water out and treat it with activated carbon.
Oh my goodness.
So that's might be the solution to prevent groundwater from migrating into the Rogue River. A place like House Street, they may have to dig out some of the highly contaminated soils if they're still there, and then install public water because the plume has gotten too far off site. We can't control the plume.
Is there any hope in the future that, I mean, there are people researching into the possibilities of cleaning groundwater?
There are quite a bit of there's quite a bit of research going on right now about groundwater cleanups, and there's different technologies to immobilize the PFAS to actually break it down, and I'm not sure which one will work, but something will be found.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like all of this information is something that could be shared in this public advisory council that you're proposing.
Right. Typically, we public advisory councils get a small amount of funding from the state government, and we do bring in experts. We network with the university. We network with local consulting firms, laboratories, and we try and get the best solutions for the problems that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Well, I totally support that idea.
Thank you.
And I've certainly made it clear that if anyone wants to participate in this project with you, they can contact me. They can probably contact you as well.
Sure.
We'll put those addresses up on the show today, or I'll get it to you. But I think we probably are at the point where I just want to say again, thank you so much for the research that you've done and the flags that you raised that made it possible for us to start moving forward on this, because we call it a crisis. Is that an overstatement?
Well, it is. It's a contaminant that's affecting not only the local area, but also a number of cities in Michigan. Wordsmith Air Force Base, DoD facilities, the Huron River has a fishing advisory throughout its entire water course now. So it's an issue that's affecting a number of people, and it's large enough where we need to go after it in a coordinated manner.
Right. Well, again, thank you for your leadership on that. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so if you would like to participate in the citizens group under Dr. Rediske's leadership, you can send me an email at debhavensforkempcounty@gmail.com. And that's it for Kent County Close-Up. Thanks for joining me and the production crew here at GRTV in Grand Rapids, Michigan.